Uh, First of all, I would like to welcome and thanks to you to come to this public lecture organized by the Uncoordinated Department of Economics and the ANU Indonesia project. My name is Budi Reso Sudarmo. I'm currently the head of ANU Indonesia project. I would like to start by acknowledging the first Australian on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Stephen Kennedy, Secretary of the Department of Treasury, to make some opening remarks and chair the lecture. Stephen.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd just like to begin by associating myself with your remarks around the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay respects to elders past, present, and future. Firstly, a big thank you to the Crawford School and the ANU Indonesia project for inviting me here this evening. Tonight, we're very fortunate to hear from Dr. Chatib Basri, or Pak Didi, it's easier to say, Pak Didi, as he is widely known, on the topic of the political economy of Indonesia's 2045 vision. A little bit of history. It turns out that we were both students here doing our masters and our PhDs at roughly the same time. We probably sat in the same, had coffee together with the academics in the Coombs building, morning and afternoon tea. I used to spend a lot of time trying to hide from Adrian Pagan because he always asked really difficult questions.
That's exactly my problem.
But I think we both really value this institution for what it's given to both of us. In terms of intellectual output. It supported me, and I know Pak Didi will support it enormously. The other thing I want to say is the importance of ANU and the personal relationships with Indonesia. At Treasury, we value this enormously. We would have to say it is close to one of our most effective relationships, frankly, in the Treasury portfolio. We've had people posted in Indonesia for many years. We had a delegation here actually last week. There's a strong sense of joint purpose. Really, I think a great example of how two countries can pursue their national interests but work very productively together, including when they're such close neighbours. I probably don't need to remind you that Prime Minister Albanese made his first bilateral visit to Indonesia less than 2 weeks after being elected. I got to know the political class pretty well over quite a few years. It doesn't change on either side. The relationship with Indonesia is absolutely central to Australia. It's a real partnership. We recognise the significance of the Indonesian economy. We're going to hear a lot about it today from Pak Didi. But it's clearly one of the globally important economies in the world. It will become more globally important, and a very, as I said, a very important bilateral relationship with us. Just quickly, a little bit about Didi. He's been central to the long-standing and trusted relationship between Australian Treasury and the industry and the Indonesian Ministry of Finance. He was a special advisor to the Finance Minister, Sri Mulyani, 15 years ago when Treasury staff were first seconded to Jakarta. As we were discussing earlier, he knows the current Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, very well through that relationship, the strong relationship that Wayne Swan had with Sri Mulyani and the strong relationship that Jim Chalmers enjoys today with Sri Mulyani. We've worked very closely over the past 2 years, Indonesia hosting ASEAN this year and the G20 last year. And I have to say, from our observation, demonstrating its leadership role regionally globally. Difficult times, very well led by Indonesia in difficult times. Lots of conflict, lots of difficulty out there. And Indonesia has done a great job in managing those important global events. And as I said, its rising economic significance cannot be denied. Its GDP has now surpassed 1 trillion and is growing steadily at 5% per year. But we may hear some more about perhaps why we should hope for even more. So, look, I'm really looking forward to hearing Eddie's views on this evening and in his lecture. I have had the opportunity to have a little brief look at what's coming, and I can assure you it's a very interesting presentation about prospects for Indonesia. And the last thing I would have to say, thank you so much to the ANU and the Corporate School and others for inviting me to come over. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully a demonstration of a series that we at Treasury, but the Australian government more broadly, takes the relationship with Indonesia. So please join me in welcoming Pak Didi to the stage.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Is someone in the back can hear me? Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. When you mentioned about Adrian Pagan, all the nightmares back again. I still remember economic seminar on my PhD program, and he criticized my econometrics model. He said that there's something wrong here. So when I asked him what would be the solution, then he said that I haven't found the solution, but it's model is wrong. So, but thank you again, Stephen. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here, to be back in Canberra. It's more like city nowadays compared to 15 years ago. I was here, the last time was probably back on 2018. Yeah, I always call this Canberra is the opposite of Jakarta. If Jakarta city without plans, Canberra is a plan without city. And now I can see more development. I believe the economic growth is faster than 7%. So let me start with my presentation today. Is Indonesia 2045 the political economy of the possible? I mentioned to Pak Stephen the reasons why I put the word the political economy of the possible, because I'm humbled by the political reality. Yeah, I got the advantage to live in the both world, academic world and also as a foreign policy maker. So I try to look at this perspective from this whether this policy is also politically feasible. So before I start, last night I asked ChatGPT about how many papers have been written for Indonesia with the title Indonesia at the Crossroads. You know what's the answer? ChatGPT couldn't find the total number because so many papers have been written under the title of Indonesia at the Crossroads. So I asked the opposite questions about how many papers have been written with the word part of the sentence of the title, the bright future of Indonesia. And they couldn't find the answer as well, because so many paper has been written under that kind of title. So this reminds me with the Indonesia project at the ANU. Why? Because the political section is always pessimistic about Indonesia, and the economic department is always too optimistic about it. So, Pak Stephen, if we are an econometrician, we know that ANU is always right, because it's a mean the average of the random variables, right? So we are being realistic. So that is why I always said that, it's been quoted by Glenn in his book about Jokowi's mental contradiction. I call Indonesia a disappointing country. It disappoints the optimists and also disappoints the pessimists. Yeah, so this is basically my presentation today. Sorry. I always get a problem with technology. It shows that I'm a dinosaur, actually. So this is just a little bit of the background of it.
Indonesia experienced a complex and difficult reform, but we've been doing relatively well. And the last 10 years, we grew by 5%. The exact number was actually 4.8%. Yeah. And then the income per capita has increased from 1,222 in 2004 to 4,580 in 2022. Not too bad. Yeah. This growth has pushed Indonesia into the group of middle-income countries, and many people, wrote a very optimistic, prediction about Indonesia to become the fourth largest economies in the world. But the challenge is there is a risk of the middle-income trap. Yeah. So this is the background. So the question to be addressed, my supervisor is here. So every time I give a presentation, he always asks me, start with the research question. This is the research question. Will Indonesia be able to accelerate its transition from middle to high income status by 2045? The second question is, what can be done given the political and institutional constraint? That's what I call the political economy of the possible. Now, unfortunately, the Fed does not provide the latest data on this. This is a very interesting because we try to calculate the relative income to the US to make a comparison. Interestingly, if you look at on these charts until 2010, I believe, Indonesia doubled its relative income per capita compared to 1970, but it took 40 years. So it was very slow. Similar pattern to middle-income countries in Southeast Asia, except Philippines. If you compare to countries like Thailand, they perform better than us. Malaysia is also perform better than us. So the question is, if this kind of trajectory will continue or not. Of course, the 1997 financial crisis had a devastating impact, and if we extrapolate, I believe that COVID-19 also had a similar impact, even though not as deep as what we had back on 1997. Now, let me start to lay out the background. Yeah? Everyone is talking about the demographic bonus, the golden Indonesia by 2045. And the reason behind it is, if you look at on this chart is, we will have this demographic bonus by 2025 because the total dependency ratio will be around 45%. But interestingly, if you look at by 2050, this dependency ratio will tend to increase to around 57. And if you look at the source of the contribution to increase of the dependency ratio, it is not contributed by the child dependency ratio, because the child dependency ratio dropped from 47 to 31. But the source of issue come from the old dependency ratio, from 7.3% to around 26%. So what's the story? It means that by 2050, there is a risk that Indonesia will start to enter the aging population. So if we want to accelerate the growth, we believe in the Modigliani model, the permanent income, income hypothesis, etc. So we do have this window opportunity until 2050. So we have about 27 years to accelerate the economic growth. So let me make a comparison. This is just a nominal per capita income. If you look at South Korea and Japan, when Japan and South Korea entered the aging population, it's probably in the year of 2000 at that time, their income per capita has been already higher than 30,000 US dollars. And yet, countries like Korea and Japan, and they are facing a problem of the aging population. Also Australia. So if we make a projection using this current growth, Indonesia by 2050, when we enter the aging population, our income per capita will still be less than 30,000. So there is a risk for us to grow out without becoming rich. The question is why this is going on. I'm not going to use the word dangerous, why this is risky for us. Because if you look at Japan and South Korea or China, they had an experience for the double-digit growth for so many years before they entered the aging population. But not in our case. The highest economic growth was during the Suharto era, was around 8%. We never reached the 10% economic growth. So if people talk about 5% looks good compared to many countries, I completely agree, but this is not enough because we start from the low level. So we need to grow faster than what we have. Yeah, if you're talking about this 5%, this is good if you compare to Vietnam, to Singapore nowadays, to maybe to Australia, to some other countries, but this definitely not will bring Indonesia to become the the upper income group. Now, the solution is we must accelerate our GDP growth. This is pretty clear. The question is, this is the document from the Bappenas, the National Planning Agency. They create the terms that Indonesia goal is maybe probably the right terms for this is the golden Indonesia by 2045. And according to Bappenas, if we want to escape the MIT, the middle income trap, the transformative, we need to grow at least by 6%. Yeah, if we want to have this optimistic scenario, the 7% growth by 2038. And according to them, those are all the factors that we need to do. Focus on science, technology, innovation, economic productivity, green economy, digital transformation, domestic and global economic integration, cities as center of economic growth. And this is the first phase. I don't want to go into this detail. You can consult with the document from the National Planning Agency about us. My question is, can we do that? Will Indonesia be able to do it? So let me start to look at about the source of growth. If you look at the source of economic growth before the 1996, very interesting because the source of growth was basically driven by the investment. But after the 1998, the investment growth was slowing down. And this trend continued until today. Yeah, if you look at the latest data, economic growth of this Indonesian economy, we grew less than 5% in terms of this investment. But interestingly, consumptions become the source of growth because the huge domestic market, etc. So I don't think this will be sustainable. I'll explain to you later on why. The way I look at it, we need to focus on investment and trade because I don't think to rely only on consumption. This will bring Indonesia in the 6 to 7% economic growth. So bear with me. I understand that not all of you are student economics, but I promise to speak in the human language. I always tell Budi that the problem with economists, Pak Stephen, they like to speak in the language that no one can understand. The more people confused, the better they are as an economist. I promise to be a bad economist now. So this is basically the data. We are not very efficient nowadays. The incremental capital output ratio, or in the human language, is 1% additional growth will require investment over GDP about 6.8. Yeah, so not very efficient. Why? Because under Suharto, the incremental capital output ratio or ICON was around 4. During SBY administration, was around 5. Nowadays, it's about 6.8. Why? Because we focus on the infrastructure, in which will yield probably about 10 years from now. The capex is already there, but the result, will come later. That's explained why the ICON is relatively high. So if I take the ICON average 2016 to 2022, and we want to grow by 6 to 7%, so we need investment over GDP 6 to 7% multiplied by the ICON. So we will need the investment over GDP between 41 to 48%. This is too high. for 6 to 7% economic growth. Because under Suharto, if you want to grow by 7%, you only need investment over GDP around 28% at the time. During SBY administration, you only need investment over GDP around 35%. So definitely, this I-Core become an issue. The problem is the gross domestic savings for Indonesia, according to the World Bank data, is only 37. I believe for the students, we learn from the macroeconomic class that the saving investment gap is a reflection of the current account deficit, right? So if, let's say, we want to push the economic growth to 7%, and the investment over GDP is 48%, whereas the savings is 37%, there is a gap of the saving investment around 11%. And I don't think market will accept us if the current account deficit is around 11%. I do understand when I took class from John Pittsburgh long time ago at the what's the name? Allen Building in the Department of Economics. He told me that you don't need to worry about current account deficit as long as the capital coming in, you just use the flexible exchange rate, it will solve everything. Yeah, I mentioned to Pak Stephen, I really envy Australia can use the flexible exchange rate as the shock absorption. But unfortunately, my experience when I had to deal with the paper tanker 2013, I cannot use this exchange rate as the only shock absorber. I had to come up at that time with a policy mix, did something on the fiscal policy, raising the interest rate a little bit, and some macro prudential. I understand maybe my good friend Rosnick White may have different view on this. We can have a discussion on this. Yeah. So what we learned in the class, the so-called the Catholic Church approach to monetary policy doesn't work very well. Yeah, using the so-called the unholy alliance, the impossible agreement. Somehow we need to do the so-called the policy mix. So based on our experience, countries having current account deficits more than 3% and are financed by a portfolio are called vulnerable. Except this is financed through the foreign direct investment in export-oriented sector. Yeah, why is it export-oriented sector? Because if you focus on domestic market, then your revenue in the rupiah, then you pay the profit repatriation in the US dollar, there is a risk of the currency mismatch. So that is why, this is rather difficult. Unfortunately, I know this is unfair with now is the president of Singapore. We sort of discussed in Bali for the emerging developing economies, it is unfair every time the current account deficit went above 3%. It was punished by the market. In fact, the emerging developing economies, we should run the current account deficit higher than 3% because we don't have the competitive advantage of capital, right? But it is fine that the portfolios become a problem. So under this kind of situation, what will be the policy options? And before I come to this room, I had a brief discussion with the student, and one of the students asked me about the policy options for any candidates of the president. So let me share with you my feelings. Whenever they become a president, they are constrained by this. Yeah, you can always talk about everything during the campaign, but 6 months after you become a president, you become an normal president. And you see the available resources. So the policy options is only improve the productivity, meaning it means that lower the I-Core through the human capital. What does it mean? When I was at the MOF, we started to allocate the budget for the so-called LPDP. And let me ask you, how many of you come from under the LPDP program? But I do understand with this LPDP program, this will take 1 generation before you come to your institution and change the system, etc. Yeah, I started this idea, and also not only that, Pak Stephen, I also started the second month with the Australian Treasury. I sent my staff to learn because we established the fiscal policy office to learn from the Australian Treasury on 2006 at the time. So Australia played a very instrumental role in our fiscal policy. So that one, but that will take one generation. As a policymaker, your problem is the political cycle is only maximum 10 years. You don't have the luxury to talk about something beyond 10 years. Your president, your prime minister will not be very interested, because the question is, why should I spend my political capital if my successor will take the benefit of it? So you should come with a policy that can be done in less than 10 years. So what will be the short-term solution to achieve? The short-term solution is maybe to do a training. Back on the 1980s, all of Indonesian bankers were Citibank alumni. Why is that? Because Citibank had a very good program for the so-called ODP, for the development. So I was thinking that maybe we can't rely on the government to provide the training, because they don't have capacity, they don't have the resources. But what about the private sector to do it? If you want to learn about data science, why don't we ask Google to do it? Why don't we ask Facebook or Meta to do it? And we gave the double deduction tax. I'm not a big fan of the tax incentive, but I would call this is the sober industrial policy. If you want to do the intervention, do something on the supply side rather than protecting the sectors. So we can have a discussion about it. That's one way to sort of like to improve the human capital. Infrastructure, definitely we know that we need to develop infrastructure. Governance. I discussed with Pak Steven. There's a lot of interest to invest in Indonesia, but the problem is why Indonesia just receive or get the investment, the foreign direct investment, much less compared to Vietnam. And this issue has to do with the so-called the business climate. One of the reasons of why many Indonesians become religious is because they have to deal with the government. I was chairman of the investment board. I know, if people apply for the investment, there is nothing they can do except pray to God. Because the process was completely like a black box. Until one day the government said, we are very happy to advise you that your application has been approved by the government. That is why when I was at the investment board, I created this idea was, I was inspired by FedEx, by DHL, because every time I bought a book from Amazon, I can trace in which area the book is in. So if people apply apply for investment, I give them PIN and they can trace in which table the documents start. I don't solve the problem, but people are so happy because it's more certain. So the issue is more about certainty. So improving this investment climate, this will take some time, but we have to be very realistic. I'll touch about this issue later on. So what can we do? I remember, Pak Steven, I had a discussion with President Jim Kim, who's the President of the World Bank at the time, and also Madame Lagarde. I told to both of them that the policy recommendation from the Fund and World Bank are always first. The problem is we can only implement it 25 years from now, because always require the first-rate institution, and we don't have it. So if the institution is still in the Jurassic Park, don't come up with the policy recommendation by Star Wars. It's not going to work. We need to think about the best fit in the short term, while in the medium term we talk about the best practice. So FDI in export, I mentioned about it, business climate, and increase export tax to GDP. This is very important because our tax ratio is now only about 9%. There is no way Indonesia can finance all the all the projects, etc., with the tax ratio 9%. My sense is after the COVID, there is a risk of the scaling effect. First, there is a risk of the rising inequality, the K-shaped recovery, because the one who get an access for the digital, will perform relatively well. The second one, there is a risk of the setback the quality of the human capital, because according to the study conducted by ADB, only 27% of about 27% of people did not have an access for the online during the COVID. So we will see the impact probably a couple of years from now. The third one is widening gender gap. because the sector was affected by during the COVID was informal sector, in which most of them are women and children. Yeah. So the design for the future fiscal policy will be more inclusive. We need to invest more on health, on education, on social protection. But the problem is, if the tax revenue to GDP is only 9%, it won't be enough. I will touch this issue later on. So the question is, under this kind of situation, is policy continuity or change? I don't see much room for the policy change. You won't see, much, every candidate can talk about something new, but at the end of the day, you need to be very realistic about the real situation. Yeah. So I mentioned to you, this is exactly what we discussed. Yeah. Shifting towards high economic growth cannot happen instantly. We need to improve on focus on productivity, education, health, governance, infrastructure development, increased tax ratio, external financing, and managing political process. So this is basically the standard. Yeah. And this is the problem with economics. We all know what to do. Yeah. But later on, whether can we implement it, that's become the second question. So now let me move. Okay, if we want to improve productivity to promote growth, I had a very interesting discussion with Ricardo Hausman last April. He posed me a very interesting question. He asked me, many people say that one of the reasons why India, China, and Indonesia, is attractive, very attractive to foreign investors because the huge domestic market. Yeah, strong domestic market. That's really very important one. But the question is, why China only grew faster after the 80s? Why India only after the 90s? Why Indonesia after the mid 80s? Those three countries have had the large domestic market since long time ago. And his answer is, this has to do with the export, because it will push productivity to the maximum one, to the frontier. So that's remind me of my old paper with Samsul Harja. If any of you are interested, it's published in the part of the chapter published by the World Bank. The title is "Should Indonesia Say Goodbye to the Export Facilitating Strategy?" And then based on our look at this against. I don't want to talk about this econometrics because it reminds me with my nightmare again with Adrian Paga during the economic seminar. But based on the co-movement between innovation, it shows that export, provide this largest contribution for the economic growth. Yeah, it's not the government consumption, it's not gross fixed capital formation, it is export. And makes sense because it's push Indonesia to become competitive. Now the problem is, if you rely so much on export, your country will be very volatile, similar like Australia, right? Nowadays, Indonesia, we maintain the economic growth about 5% or slightly below 5%. Why? Whereas Singapore is 0.1%. Why? Because in Singapore, the export ratio to GDP is 180%. In Vietnam is 120%, whereas in the case of Indonesia is 25%. So when the global economy collapsed, the impact, what we learn in macroeconomics, the repercussion effect to Indonesia is only 25%. And that's explained why we are able to maintain the economic growth. But the other side of the coin, when the global recovery happening, the economic recovery in Indonesia will be much slower compared to many countries in the world. So the risk is always about the volatility. So we did some calculation to look at about the correlations between export volatility and, of course, I forgot the total observation that we did. But interestingly, there is a negative correlations between the typical of industry and the export volatility. If the share, so let me speak in the human language, if the share of medium high-tech manufacturing increase, then the export becomes less volatile. Which makes sense, right? If you rely on this commodity natural resources, you will be exposed for the boom bust cycle. But if your share of resource-based manufacturing, quite significant, then you are exposed to the export volatility. I believe that that's also happened to Australia, to Canada. So that is why some people said that maybe one way to do it, we should focus on this industrialization to make this export become stable. Of course, the other solution is will be to diversify not only the product but also the market destination. Now this is the sort of like a picture of our export until 2008. The Harvinder index of product concentration is pretty high, and if you look at the share of production to total export, dominated by natural resources. And if you look at the TCF, the textile, clothes, footwear, and low technology, steadily decline. The question is, can we continue to rely only on the cheap labor industrial manufacturing sector? The issue is we have to look into account the political economy issue as well when we are talking about this. Now, Indonesia is a country with, again, the resource-rich countries. So the other instrument, I was talking about trade. What about the fiscal? Unfortunately, if you look at this terms of trade and the primary fiscal balance, the fiscal balance is pro-cyclical. So I would like, I don't know, Pak Stephen, whether this is also applies for Australia, maybe not, but in many resource-rich countries, the primary balance is pro-cyclical for the resource-rich countries because, okay, let me, you don't need to worry about this graph. Oil price increase, the government revenue increase, but at the same time, the government need to bear the burden of the fuel subsidy, right? It's making, the spending is also increased. But when the oil price collapses, the government doesn't have the money, so they have to cut the spending. So that's explained why the fiscal become pro-cyclical. Under this kind of situation, you can't really use this fiscal policy, especially when there is a capital inflow, because theoretically, what we learned from the class, when the capital inflow coming in, what you should do is tightening the fiscal. But if the fiscal itself is pro-cyclical, you cannot use the fiscal policy. And the monetary policy is limited, the role of the monetary policy. That is why we can have a discussion about it. That makes the process become very difficult because the fiscal is pro-cyclical. Now, what about on the export sector? We try to calculate the so-called extensive and intensive margin. Intensive margin is you continue to produce the same product at the same market. And the extensive margin is all product at the existing market, but the products that you haven't been sold before. If you look at the so-called discovery in the case of Indonesia, almost nothing. So we continue to produce the same product since the Netherlands, India, it's a long time ago until today. The question is, if we need innovations, then we need human capital. But the problem is, Indonesia is a country in which the PISA score is number 8 from the bottom. And that's the reason why we come up with the idea of the LPDP. When I can share with you, when we proposed this idea, it was a bit sort of like a resistance come from many. Why should we provide a scholarship to the smart people, not doing the affirmative action? I was asked by President SBY, if you give the scholarship for someone who get accepted in the top 200 universities in the world, there is a possibility they may come from the rich family. Because in order to get accepted in AAU, you have to make sure that you have a good proficiency in English. Probably you need to take some courses. You may come from the middle and upper income group. But I said to President SBY at that time, we need a locomotive. That's why we introduced this LPDP. We copied this program from Minister Tarman at the time. He was the Minister of Finance before us, Minister of Education. But if you look at this is something that we need to improve. That is why investing in human capital is very important. The other issue is about the logistic performance. The next, this is really bad. The next issue that we need to address, let me just explain about this slide, is Indonesia has to move to do something related to net zero emission. Because as a country in the what do you say that is equatorial, yeah, and also with the archipelago, we are prone to the issue of this rising sea level, the drought issue, etc. You know, the rising the climate change issue. So under this kind of situation, it is very important for Indonesia to focus on the climate. But the problem is, let me share with you, climate change for many developing economies is a luxury goods. Why? Because we are too busy with the day-to-day problem of poverty, of poor quality of education, lack of infrastructure. So everyone can talk, make the commitment, MOU about climate, but on the implementation side, very little. So I'm humbled by the political reality. So the only way to push government on the emerging developing economies to comment on the climate is to link it with development. Without that, it would be very difficult. Because otherwise, this is an issue about 50 years. The politician will say, again, of course, in every meeting, they will say that they are committed to it, but every politician will think, if I do something on this, my successor will take the benefit of it. Why don't I just focus on something that could be done in the short period of time? So the first issue is weathering the transition. This is really Indonesia's resource-rich country. So what will be the compensation? We can have a discussion about it. There is an issue about the fiscal of the PLN, etc. Financing the green economy will require about 28.5 billion US dollars to achieve the NDC. Yeah, limited fiscal capability, and the most important one is investing in the renewable energy will be very difficult if the government do not adjust fuel price. Because what's the point for you to invest in EV if the fossil fuel is only 40 cents to the dollar, right? And this is something that politically not easy. So how are we going to finance this? I'm involved on this independent expert group for climate finance chaired by Nixon. Yeah, so we prepare, this is not only for Indonesia. There should be a combination of the so-called the domestic resource mobilization, in which that maybe we need to phase out the fuel subsidy. And the narrative is, I call this policy as triple win. We use this money for the direct cash transfer. It's good for the poor people, it's good for macro, and it's good also for the environment to use the demand capacity. Yeah. External financing through the MDBs, the concession bonds, the SDR we discussed, and the multilateral development bank. And but those things is not enough. We probably need to do the de-risking with the innovative financing as well. The blended finance in order to invite the private sector to come in. And then my friend, my colleague Adam Triggs, he wrote a very interesting paper about the Basel reform. Maybe we have to think to do some reform in which the green asset is considered a high quality asset. If that's the case, then we can release this green asset, then the cost of fund for financing the climate, can become reduced quite significantly. Now, the next slide is, what about the revenue? I was talking about this increase taxation. This is very important for us. Can we increase the tax rate? This is the 2x2 matrix from the feasibility, politically, institutionally, the quick wins, and the impact. If we want to increase the tax revenue, politically is very difficult. Look at this in this matrix is low, but the impact is very high. Why? In any country in the world, increasing the tax rate is not popular. Yeah. So what should we do? I wrote a paper with Ben Olken, with Mayara Felix Rimahana, about this. If any of you will be interested and to consult, I suggest you to look at our paper, the American Economic Review last 2021. Yeah, the idea is very simple. We focus on the administrative reform rather than tax rate. What should we do? let me talk, this is rather technical. In Indonesia, anyone from the tax office here? Oh, you are from the tax office. One account representative is responsible maybe for 4,000 taxpayers. Am I right? How on earth you can scrutinize this data? So what they do, he and his friends do, they just focus on the rich 10% maybe, because they don't have the capacity. So as a result, every company, if they want to grow faster, they will scrutinize by tax office. So every company will avoid to grow faster. What they do, they split the offset, the revenue, etc. So it's very difficult to collect. So the solution is very simple. You move the taxpayer from the small tax office into the medium tax office. That's called increase the tax revenue quite significantly. The Minister Sri Mulyani, she's happy with that. She started to adopt this idea, I think, starting last year by building about 38 additional the medium tax office. The second one, reduce the tax exemption. The problem in Indonesia is about the tax exemption. Yeah, by definition, GDP is sum of value added. So if your value added tax is about 10%, it's supposed to be the 10%. But the problem is so many exemptions. That's create discussion. Probably we don't need the VAT like 10% as long as this is uniform. This could increase the revenue significantly. Thirdly, review the tax expenditure. I understand that some people in the tax office is supporting it, but of course you cannot talk about it because government always believe that they can solve every problem by giving the tax expenditure. Yeah, our tax expenditure review is about 1.6% of GDP, but the economic growth remained about 5%. I'm not a big fan of the tax incentive. So this is just an example about what the government can do. I don't want to go into detail. Otherwise, as if I sort of like proposing something for the candidates for the president. On the expenditure side, we just focus on the quality of spending. If you look at the review of effectiveness of the fuel subsidy, I believe that everyone is familiar with this. This is definitely things that we need to do. Now is the share of the energy subsidy to GDP is about 1.5 to 2%, maybe. Yeah. And I do a calculation. If let's say, of course, this is the hypothetical, we allocate all this subsidy to the direct cash transfer, we can finance about 60% of the Indonesian, similar like India, the universal basic income, and the amount is still lower than the fuel subsidy. So it's just to give an example of it. Yeah. Now let me move to, we are talking about this from the economic perspective, but I always like what Jean-Claude Juncker said. We all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected. This is the reality. As a kind of that, you can say this is all the list things that you do. But the politician said, wait a minute. This is the problem, as Thomas Sowell said, that the first questions, the first lesson of economics is about scarcity, because there is never enough resources to satisfy anyone. But the problem is the first lesson of politics is how to ignore the first lesson of economics. Yeah. So this is the reality. Now let me talk from the political economy perspective. That's what I call my presentation is the political economy of course. Look at this. This study is provided by the World Bank. I had a big debate with political scientists about the definition of middle class. It's unclear, but I don't want to go into detail about this debate. How do we define it? This is more like the consuming class. The way World Bank explain it, there is a group of people, the so-called poor, vulnerable, aspiring middle class. Aspiring middle class is more or less the middle class one. Yeah. It's a middle class and upper class. And they use the per capita consumption for this. You can get the slides later on. I don't want to go into detail. They provide the definition. Interestingly, one thing that I would like to share with you. If you look at the poor, vulnerable, aspiring middle class, and upper class, the share of this middle class is growing. Yeah, the share of middle class is growing. The interesting part is this. Look at the pattern of consumption. If you are, this is the Engels law. If you are poor, most of your consumption is basically something that related to the issue of the basic needs. When you become very rich, you start to talk about leisure, about entertainment, etc. Right? So it means that the behavior is different. So my point is the policy that we adopt so far maybe should also change if the composition of the society is like this. So this is a very interesting story. I read a very interesting book written by Sebastian Edwards. He is now with the University of California of Los Angeles. Edwards has the authority to write about Chicago Boys because he graduated from the Catholic Pontificia University in Chile, and he went to University of Chicago under the supervision of the famous Arnold Harberger. This is the father of the Chicago Boys. The interesting part is Edwards was a supporter of Allende. So somehow he can make a distance when he writes paper. He is very interesting. Why is that? Because in his book, he said that Chile is the best performer in the Latin America. Number one in terms of economic growth, in terms of this. If you look at the Gini coefficient, not too bad actually. Yeah, but interestingly, in terms of the perception, change in the perception of inequality, not too good. So the question is, Chile experienced rapid economic growth, the fastest reduction of poverty. They reduced the poverty from 53% back in the mid-80s to less than 6% in 2006. Yeah. Many Chilean, but the problem is many Chilean citizens feel that inequality has greatly increased. So the Basta, the revolution or the demonstration triggered the violent social unrest. That's become the so-called the Chile paradox. How do we explain this? Because economists always believe as long as the economic growth is there, the poverty reduction is there, you don't need to worry about the social unrest. But the case of Chile shows that the opposite. How do we explain this? And Edwards come up with, in his study, he shows that there is an issue about the vertical versus horizontal inequality. Economists always focus on the so-called vertical inequality. We just look at about the inequality through Gini coefficient from income or spending. But the issue is, it is true that Chile was not too bad compared to many countries in terms of inequality. But if you look at this ranking in sample for 40 nations, Chile was not doing relatively well compared to many countries in Latin America. Yeah, but in terms of ranking in the sample of 40 nations, housing, income, jobs, community, etc. And the second possibility is maybe the narrative, because people criticize the so-called the neoliberal policy. This is what John Rawls called the field of ignorance. Yeah, because the perception. Last but not least, and this is very important, this is relevant to Indonesia. There is a gap between expectation and reality. Even though we are making progress about the reform, but if the speed is considered is not enough, then people will be satisfied. So this issue was discussed among the Chicago Boys with, I forgot his name, Lauders, if I'm not mistaken. He was asked about the issue of inequality, but he is an economist, got a PhD from Chicago. They said that if you're talking about inequality, it's about envy. It is not an economic problem. Yeah, envy is not about economic problem. So we just focus for the extreme poverty to focus on the bottom 10%. Now the question is this relevant for the case of Indonesia? Because we need to manage this. This is from my paper with Hao Hill on the Asian Economic Policy Review. I forgot the title, is Managing Economy Under the Democratic Transition Environment. So I use this chart. It's a very interesting about the youth unemployment in Indonesia. Yeah, the youth unemployment by education. Interestingly, if you look at the youth unemployment in total, dropped significantly from 22 to 18, almost 90% by 2022. But if you look at by education, senior high school, bachelor diploma, vocational school is increasing. So how do we explain this? Most of the people absorb mostly at the level of education, junior high school or lower. This is a very interesting to look at, to do the cross-check with the presidential exit vote based on education. Prabowo, at that time, he was in opposition to Jokowi. If you look at this, Prabowo, most of the voters from Prabowo come from people with the background of the high school or the university college. So it shows that they are not very happy with the Jokowi's administration at the time, because Jokowi was not able to provide good job for the high school and the university college, right? So if we ask about this demographic bonus, then the next question is, what kind of job that you can provide? If you fail to provide a good job through the industrialization or the skilled worker to training, then this become a political issue. Yeah, Jokowi at this stage very popular because he could absorb the unemployment, but only for the junior high school and lower. He's very popular among rakyat, but maybe not among the educated one. So if I send students to Australian National University to become a PhD, when they return to Indonesia, they don't get a job because the expectation is very high, right? In Indonesia, only the poor people could afford to be unemployed. If you are rich, you have the non-labor income, you probably don't want to take the job with the low skill. Yeah, so this become an issue. I don't know, maybe about 10 years from now. 10 years from now, maybe the president will be elected if he or she can solve the problem of congestion, of waste, of parking. It's no longer talking about, the situation is very different. Yeah. Now, look at what happened. No violence, no justice. Look at the case of the question is, can middle class play a role in reform of social things? If you look at the people in the social media, they criticize everything. Look at the case of Sambo. Unless they go, Sambo is, by the way, was the provost in police. Become a big issue because people started, raise this issue in the social media until the president took the issue and said that there should be investigation. And Saiful Mahdi, I believe, would be involved in this as well. They criticized the government because Saiful Mahdi was sent to jail simply because he responded in the WhatsApp group. Is that right? Yeah. And then the rector was not happy with that and reported to the police. Then everyone, become an issue in the social media, and the president gave an amnesty. I recall about the case of Gojek, very interesting. On Saturday morning, Minister of Transportation announced the new regulation to ban the ride-hailing because in Indonesia we did not recognize the modality of transportation using the motorcycle. Interestingly, this is the shortest government regulation. It was announced 9 a.m. by 12 noon time, the president canceled it. Because everyone, they feel the benefit of this project. Yeah. So the question is, if you look at this kind of trend, no corruption in the tax and the custom. Yeah, I believe you're familiar with the SNU, Rafael Alun. Yeah. So the question is, can middle class play a role for reform and social change? I don't know the answer. My friend in Monash, Fedi Hadis, is very skeptical about it because as a structuralist, he always believed that only the labor, can make a worker, can make a change. The government will respond to it as long as it doesn't really threaten their power. So we don't know. But I think it is very important to look at about this issue in managing the political economy. And this is the governance indicators of Indonesia. We are not too bad, but also not very good. Yeah, so we are in the middle. Somehow it's like Chile. The question is whether the Chilean paradox will happen. Under this kind of situation, managing the political economy become very difficult. Why is that? Because the government need to accommodate so many issues. Yeah, so this will be my last slide. The problem is when we look at the reality, the economists are usually blame politics or institutional failure. But the question I think is at the given constraint, how to incentivize leaders to support the reform rather than blaming the politics. How to incentivize leaders, try to find the common. So, for example, is we have to find the policy like economically sound and politically sound. The LTA, the cash transfer, is just an example. It works both sides. Yeah. And domestic politics. Now, maybe the situation is rather different with the geopolitical tension. Indonesia doesn't have the luxury to choose between US and China. Yeah, so we probably have to look at about this issue as well. Many countries now in the prisoner's dilemma. We know the best solutions will be cooperation, but because everyone is focused on the economic security, we focus on the short term, which is we don't want to cooperate. Look at what happened in the case of Argentina, India, restrict export, for example. Critical mineral. Yeah, we can discuss about it later on. So under this kind of situation, look at the global trend. Yeah, I call it this techno-nationalism, the climate change issue. There is a tendency that maybe we can't really expect that there will be an outward-looking help going along backwardist model. I don't think will work nowadays because leaders will say, "Why should I open my economy if the other part of the world become protectionist?" Yeah, if you expect the multilateral, I'm not so sure because the process is so uncertain. So open regionalism like RCEP is maybe one of the solutions. Yeah, we can discuss that. And now the political economy is of the possible. How to work within constraint? We have to be very realistic. So I'm not too optimistic about everything, but everything can do. I remember when Pak Wijoyo, who was the architect of the Indonesian economy, I asked him why he decided to focus on liberalization in financial sector rather than real sector. Because if we follow the theory, according to Ron McKinnon, also Sebastian Edwards, we should do reform from the real sector first and then followed by financial sector. But he replied to me, he said that, Dede, the window opportunity to do reform is not like in textbook. Whatever is option available, you just do it. Yeah, you don't have the luxury to wait until the sequential is like in the process, like what we learned from the textbook. That's what I call this to work within constraint. Yeah, that's why Indonesia started with the liberalization of the financial reform and then later on the third reform. Problem is, we like to do the big bang approach, but the question is, do we have enough political resources? If you don't have enough political resources, pick up your own battle and then create a success story. You got the political support, you move to the more complex and difficult reform. And I said, best fit in the short run, best practice in the long run. And focus on the problems, being flexible in solutions. I don't believe in the one size fits all solution. Yeah. And ownership of the reform is the key. And managing expectation, importance of media and communications with stakeholders become very important nowadays, especially with the social media. Yeah. And once you do something, try to institutionalize the reform. So the lesson learned from the MOF is the reasons why we are able to maintain the stability for 3 reasons. The first one is after the 1998, we reformed the financial sector. we benchmark the banking sector to the international best practice like Basel. When coming. Now the banking sector is starting to be healthy. And that's explained why, even though the Asian financial crisis in terms of magnitude was smaller compared to global financial crisis, to paper tantrum, to COVID, but not much impact on the financial sector. Why? Because the financial sector is pretty much regulated and benchmarked to the international best practice. The fiscal is anchored to the 3%. Yeah, with the fiscal goals. When I was a finance minister, every time politician come, I said that I would love to support your idea, but the maximum budget is 3%. That's the beauty to become finance minister. Maybe in the future we have to think not on the 3%, but we should look at maybe what like the fiscal rules in Chile, link it to the commodity prices. So reform, even though we criticized the fund in the beginning, somehow help us entering the global financial crisis, the paper tantrum, the COVID. So that is why the institutionalizing reform is a very important. Are we going to be pessimistic about Indonesia? I don't think so, because a lot of opportunities, as Stephen said. So let me conclude by saying, as a former chairman of the investment board, investing in Indonesia is very dangerous because it is a good. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're just going to walk around with some roving mics, just sort of the Q&A. I might make a couple of quick remarks back to get started. What is so stunning to me when I read through your presentation was how that final slide could have been written for Australia. It is a really excellent, pragmatic, concise explanation of how hard it is to do reform in any country. I like to think of myself as something that Peter Varghese, who's the former head of DFAT, basically used to describe. He described himself in policy making as a radical implementalist. And that's about the art of the possible. So many good lessons. Often you'll hear people say, how great a crisis might be for reform. But it's really only great for reform if you solve the problem, create a crisis well. Lots of economists will say, okay, we have a crisis, let's reform the whole tax system. As ministers know, that is incredibly difficult, particularly when you're in a crisis. So you saw in that last slide a very well distilled experience, I would say, that you were drawing on deeply. And the only second point I'd make as I open up the questions is one of the challenges that was set by the new Australian government was came through the discussion between the President of Indonesia and our Prime Minister, when the President said, why don't you invest in it? You have trillions of dollars in superannuation funds, why don't you invest in it? And in some ways, we've sent a guy called Nick Moore, who's he made a lot of money, investing in Macquarie in Australia, and he's been developing the Southeast Asian strategy and economic strategy, and thinking about this investment. We've sent superannuation funds over to. And once again, I think he was right on the money around what's often translated as the political risk of investing in the country. And But what I will say is that's not all about Indonesia or some of the Australians views. That's also about how Australian government's thinking about partnering with their own investors. There's many other countries, by way of example, Canadian pension funds are investing heavily in Indonesia, but Australian pension funds are not, because the Canadians have found a way of dealing with the political risk, and whether that's through political risk insurance or through partnerships. So, fabulous presentation, many insights. I wrote down so many questions, but I have to stop now because I have to give other people an opportunity to ask some questions. So who would like to ask our first question? I just up here.
Thank you. I'm Kathy from ANU. I'm actually a student of political science, so I'm sorry if this sounds bad, but I'm actually intrigued by one of your chart, in which you're saying like who's voting for who, and a lot of Bravo supporters are from college graduates. And and your argument is because of the job provided for those people are not good enough. And for me, as a student of political science, what comes to my mind is actually because of the rise of conservatism, perhaps, and the religious polarization plays out during the election. So, what my question is actually, to what extent the religious polarization conservatism is actually plays out in Indonesian economy, and maybe for the future of the world in Indonesia, do you think it will be a significant factor in the future?
I'm not a political scientist. You can ask my good friend Marcus Milton or ask me on this. But let me share with you my take. I'm not a great believer about this issue of this religious politicization. Why is it? Because if you look at on the Bell normal curve in Indonesia, the Islamic party or the party that associated with religion is always less than 30%, 30% maximum. Most of Indonesians are always, what should I call it, a nationalism sector. So this is just a matter of issues that's being used, to make you become very popular. But I don't really see the issue of this, that the radical, it's really become a big threat for all of us. I don't want to mention the specific candidates because I know them personally, and not only I know their family, and it's hard for me to say that they are radical. This one of the candidates, even his mom was Christian. So how on earth you said that is going to come up with this, the issue of radical? But that kind of issue is always being used. So this is just an instrument for the campaigning. So in terms of that, I am quite optimistic. Probably not as pessimistic as some other colleague here in the political science, to concern about the Islamic radical and the religious radical. I hope I answered to your question.
Thank you. Just down here.
Good evening, and Stephen. My name is Adam. I am a public policy student. My question is, part of either one of your policy options you mentioned about NPI is for running the sector, particularly to preserve the climate. And I noticed that in Indonesia, one of the policies that is being deployed is protection policies, especially
Protection
policies, particularly export restriction in capital and finance, to increase the investment in that sector. And so that's the first element that my question is having. Is like in the world, there's a weakening of the trade review, the WTO is not functioning as it should be. So do you think that this trend would be a trend that you will observe in the future, and in the future, maybe over the long term? And would this be practiced in other countries as well? Thank you.
I better be careful to but let me share my view. I am not dogmatic in terms of this. I entirely against the sort of industrial policy. I prefer the broad-based. In our experience with industrial policy, government is very bad in picking winner and losers are very good in picking government. That is why I'm always worried.
That was in your PhD.
Yeah.
The last thing.
But I can see now the industrial policy will stay with us for the next couple of years. And my approach is I'm being pragmatic with this. So my point is like this. If you're talking about the export restriction, let me talk about the critical mineral. Yeah. I can see the political aspiration behind it because, as I said, I'm humbled by the political behind it. But I don't think this policy will long last. Why is that? We learned from the experience in the Middle East when they imposed the embargo on oil. A couple of years after that, the renewable energy kicked in because the relative price. You know, that's also happened with the synthetic rubber. Yeah, once you impose export restriction, the relative price increase, then there is an incentive to find the substitute. Yeah, so I believe that kind of situation will also apply. The second one is this only applies to the sector specific. It might work for nickel because Indonesia is 60% suppliers of the global nickel. But if you try to introduce it to bauxite, in which we are only 30%, who will take the benefit of it? Guyana. If we did the same related to the CPO, when we tried to secure the domestic minyak goreng, the cooking oil, we did an export ban. And the one who took the benefit was Malaysia, because they are 50%. So it worked maybe for the sector specific. I'm not going to say that it would work, you know, entirely. And last but not least, I do always believe Pak Stephen is here. If we want to introduce this kind of policy, it's better to use the price. I was the one who introduced this policy back in 2014, but I used the export tax. The idea is we started with the prohibitive tax. If they build the smelter, we lower the tax until we find the competitive market. So we ensure that this process of industrial policy will still continue to be part of the global supply chain. So I can see, Pak Stephen, for example, Indonesia produced the first class of nickel for stainless steel, but we are not so good on the second class for the battery. Indonesia needs to work with Australia because you have the lithium. So Indonesia should be part of this global supply chain. So the way I look at it, I was proposing this idea, but I failed to convince my president and Minister of Agriculture at the time. Let me talk about dairy product. Yeah, cattle, beef, about the dairy product. We always talk about the importance of the self-sufficiency. But the way I look at it, the definition of self-sufficiency, it doesn't mean it should be locally produced, but locally owned. Why don't Indonesia start to think to do some acquisition with the Australian company? When you import from your own companies, and Indonesia will be part of the regional supply chains. If we want to, rather than imposing import restriction on rice, why don't we start to invest in Cambodia, in Vietnam? Then we can import rice. So we part of the global supply chains. That would be my answer in terms of this export, you know, kind of like an import or export petition. And I always believe, I learned this, you know, this trade theory from professor at AAU. Always use the, you know, rather than quantitative variable, use the price variable. So tax tariff is the second best rather than
It's just as we go to the next question, it's very interesting to think about that from the Japanese perspective in the way they've invested in Australia to ensure their energy security and the current debate around gas. We would not have developed anywhere near the reserves we've developed in Australia without investment from particularly Korea and Japan, some other countries. I just couldn't agree more with when you think about resilience, it's about who you can rely on, who owns things, who's invested things, trusted trading partners. And the answer will always be much better. Now, you missed out. Oh, would you like to do yours? And then I can. So just be clear.
Thank you, Dan, for the nice presentation. But in your presentation, you do not say anything about regionalism. And what your thought about the future of this? Like, are we already done with that, or there will be possibility?
Even the ASEAN region.
ASEAN region. What is your thought about that?
Okay. Similar like many Asian countries, I don't think Indonesia can afford to choose between US and China. Yeah. For example, like in the techno nationalism, Australia perhaps can afford to ban Huawei, the 5G. But I don't think any Southeast Asian countries can afford to ban Huawei because all the investment in terms of this telecommunication has been, the role of China has been very dominant. China is our largest trading partner. So it reminds me back on 2011 when Indonesia was the chair of ASEAN. It was President Yudhoyono and Foreign Minister Martin who come up with this proposal that is very supportive, and I do understand that strong support from colleagues in Australia about the RCEP. Right? The idea of RCEP is there is no single country in ASEAN who could deal with China bilaterally. Look at what happened to Laos and Cambodia. I was in Cambodia back in 2012 as a chairman of the investment board, and ASEAN failed to make a consensus because Cambodia was on the side to China. So nobody can deal with China bilaterally. That is why we need ASEAN as a single entity to deal with China, with Australia, with Japan, with Korea. That is why the RCEP become very important. So that's my take. Yeah, China is important, but we need a sort of like the role of the United States as well to balance the power. We need Australia to balance China. And the other thing is we need India, but unfortunately, India hasn't decided to join us. So I think the way I look at it, I'm very pragmatic, Budi. I don't think from the political economic perspective that going alone, Justice Baplati, the unilateral reform will happen in the next couple of years. The prospect of WTO is uncertain. So we have to work, being realistic. So let me share with you what can we do. Last year during the G20, it was very contentious to make the leaders declaration because the tension between Western countries and Russia related to the Ukraine issue. So Indonesia proposed very much about the idea of the pandemic fund. Now I'm the co-chair of the pandemic fund, started with the G20. The reason behind it is if you talk about pandemic and health, everybody around the table will agree on. Nobody will say no. But try to find common denominator in which we can work together for the region. Start the RCEP with something small. Don't start with the up till that. Yeah, it's very difficult. Start with something. My formula for reform is focused on the most easiest reform, but the marginal gain is very high. Once you've been successful on that, you create a success story, you move to the more complex and difficult reform. This is the peaceful approach. So what we can do with the regionalism, with the RCEP, focus on the RCEP, create some issue that everybody around the table will agree on. Maybe, I don't know, on education. A country like Indonesia, we can talk about education because the best investment Australia make on Indonesia is education. I attended the 70 years alumni of the Australian awardee. Everyone was there, from vice president, ministers, everyone. It's just the best investment in Indonesia. So start with that kind of common denominator for the RCEP. So we continue to move to the what I call the multilateral. I call this pandemic fund is testament for the multilateralism. It's small, but we have to work on it.
Judy Anderson, I'm the Vice President of the Australia-Indonesia Business Council, and everything you've said is absolutely mixed to our ears. We constantly bang on about getting all of supply chains together and work to reach each country's strength. And we're also very active around the education, because, you know, we've got financial universities not in Indonesia, and there's probably about 5 as far as we can see. So my question on education is, we're working really hard to bring Indonesia, Australia together around vocational education, because we feel that is really undercooked, and there are a number of TAFE organisations from Australia that are working on it, but it's hard, it's really hard. Your advice on the vocational education, that's really undercooked.
Couple of things. The future of the natural resources will go into more clean approach. I do believe in terms of this capacity, Australia has the comparative advantage. Can you share with us, because we have a similar, you know, factor in government, we're talking about and also the investment. Can you share with us about how we do the transition from the coal companies, for example, to give an example to Indonesia, to, I don't know, to the so-called critical, what's the critical power system? Yeah. You use the coal for the power plant, but with the clean technology. Yeah.
To make it even viable.
Yeah. So that kind of approach, because I do believe that many companies in Indonesia will need that kind of efforts to do the transition. Yeah, on the climate issue, because we have a similar problem related to do the phase out on coal. Yeah, that kind of training, I believe that would be very useful. Yeah, because not many Indonesian companies, you know, is focused on that. The other thing, this is something that I believe I always focus, but I don't know whether the Australian government would like to do it or not. Many Indonesian exporters always get a problem because your standard product is very good. I don't blame it, but my suggestion is, can we do currency in Surabaya and surrounding city? So if you reject this product, the transaction cost is likely too small, right? Rather than you send the product, export the product to Australia, and then return it back to Indonesia, and they said that it's too costly. Can we do a quarantine like the pre-shipment inspection? I don't know, in Cilacap or in Surabaya. Yeah, if we do this kind of things, we start on something that, you know, we can work together. Maybe the MOF together with the custom start to explore this possibility. So my approach is start with something small that people feel the benefit of it, then you're gonna create the possibility.
Thank you. I'm going to steer in the middle. This might need to be our
Many thanks, Valerie and Stephen. Just wanted to say, I think from everyone here, probably we did all get full credits in this semester from that very complex lecture. My question is, Indonesia's discussion includes the OECD, and how it was really surprising to see the president said that he really wanted to see reforms happen with that process of discussion. And also really interesting for Australia as well, because we have the former Minister of Finance, as the Secretary General for OECD. However, given that developing economic status provides some exceptions in protections in like WTO and other benefits as a developing country, my question is Indonesia actually really interested in being a formal advanced economy, or just expanding or becoming a larger economy?
Let me give the context first. I think I myself are somehow quite surprised with this kind of statement, because being a member of OECD is not easy. The requirement is not easy. It's like really a gold standard. But the good thing is, even though I'm not saying that we will fail, even though if there is political situation that do not allow us to become a member of the OECD. At least we do reform. So the idea is how to tie our reform to the benchmark of the OECD. I can imagine that this process is not easy, especially related to two issues. The first one is if you want to become a member of OECD, you cannot have this discrimination of the procurement. Yeah, related to the state of enterprise, to the domestic preference, etc. You should know discrimination of this. And I think I need to check, but if I'm not mistaken, maybe the government should amend the law and that the process to the parliament is not going to be easy. The second one, we discussed about the critical mineral, right? So the government always believed that the downstreaming is a game changer. Yeah, so we probably sort of like see an ambiguity in this, yeah, but at least similar to Pak Stephen is in the government, I was in the government. We always try to look at how to work within constraint. In my view is if we cannot get to the ascension to the OECD, at least we push our reform into that direction. That's what we do.
If I can just finish with an approach around our support, which I'm sure Elaine, of course, is looking at, and we're very supportive. I want to endorse those comments from faculty. Within the OECD, there's many agreements that you sign up to around, but generally, underpinning many of the things in that presentation, you spoke about one procurement. So, in finding the ways to give you a little bit of additional balance, making your arguments, I thought it was a very clever, actually, idea, and one that I can't think of the time, but that is already a substantial global part of the global economy. Could even perhaps do a little bit better. So I thought it was very clever. Thank you so much for those questions. We've run out of time. I think we have been very honest today. You're really an excellent presentation, not only on the challenges you face, but also on a menu of wonderful ways to solve those problems. So could I ask you to please join me in thanking you?
The project. I also would like to thank Stephen Kennedy for your short comment and your contribution on the discussion. Also